You killed my wife like she was a stray dog in the street. I am the law, that filthy mouth said before kicking her into silence. Now listen up. Every last one of you in that rotten hive will be on your knees, coughing up blood. I'll rip that filthy badge off your chest right in the street in front of the whole damn world. Remember the name Grace Miller, because it'll haunt you till the day you choke to death in your cell. The night market had dispersed, and the sounds of laughter, haggling, and sales pitches now lingered only in the memories of the vendors packing up to leave. The smell of fried food, fish sauce, and overripe fruit mixed with the lingering smoke from charcoal fires all blending with the dampness of worn rain tarps to create an air that was both stifling and hollow. A few food stalls still had neon lights flickering in the breeze, as if trying to cling to the last traces of a night already spent. The narrow alley behind the market was a place most people avoided if they could. It was dark, damp, and foul, with piles of trash puddles of dirty water and a wet squelch beneath every step. Grace Miller was leaving work later than usual. The hospital had a prolonged emergency case that kept her back to finishing the patient's medical record. She clutched the folder tightly to her chest, one hand pulling her purse close, walking briskly to shorten the trip home. In her mind, she could still hear the patient's heartbeat from the monitor, layered with nurses calling to each other during the shift. Fatigue weighed on her shoulders, but more than that, she longed to get home to see her husband, to sit at the small kitchen table with a cup of hot tea. She knew this path was dangerous, but taking the main road would add nearly 30 minutes, and she was spent. Footsteps echoed ahead, not rushed, not hurried, but with a deliberate rhythm that felt intentional. Grace slowed slightly, her heart picking up speed. When the neon light spilled into the narrow gap ahead, she saw Mark Rayner standing with two men in police uniforms. Mark was in the center, broad-shouldered, his face hardened by sharp lines, but his eyes glinted with contempt. He stepped forward, blocking the path, while the other two flanked out like it was a move they'd practiced. "Papers," Mark said, his voice steady but laced with mockery. His gaze swept over her like he was appraising stolen goods. "A black nurse in this area, pushing pills right at." Each word he pressed like a dull blade, not sharp enough to cut clean, but deep enough to scrape at pride. Grace swallowed the anger rising in her chest, but her voice didn't shake the way they might have expected. "You don't have the right to say that," she replied, each word sharp and clean. For a moment, she hoped her firmness might make him back off, but Mark's eyes only narrowed, and a cruel spark lit up. A short laugh came from one of the men behind him, the kind that didn't care what was right or wrong, just laughed because the victim dared to speak. Mark stepped closer, closing the gap until Grace could feel his breath, the thick stench of cigarettes mixed with strong coffee hitting her nose. His hand shot out fast and hard, grabbing her wrist and squeezing until her bones cracked. Grace tried to pull back, but his strength easily overpowered a woman worn out after a long shift. He leaned in near her ear, his voice low and heavy, each word like drops of hot tar hitting her eardrum. "Here I am, the law." In that moment, everything around her thickened. The buzz of neon lights, the drip of water from a tin roof, the stench of garbage and mold, all of it pressed down on the narrow space. Grace felt Mark's other hand shift an abrupt shove to throwing her off balance. The two men behind him moved slightly like shadows waiting for a signal. A flicker of fear flashed in Grace's eyes, but instinct kicked in and buried it. She opened her mouth to scream, but Mark's voice, cold as ice, cut her off and crushed the sound in her throat. "Tonight no one hears anything." Those words locked every exit like a blade. The alley became a trap, each wall, each patch of darkness complicit. Grace twisted her body, trying to shield herself with the folder out of reflex, but Mark knocked it to the ground. Paper scattering, some landing in filthy puddles. The sound of paper hitting water was like a period at the end of a sentence. In In the flickering neon light, the shadows of the three men covered Grace's body, swallowing her presence into the cold night. Her last thoughts before darkness overtook her were of the tiny kitchen, the thin curl of steam from a cup of tea, and Ethan's smile when she walked through the door. But all of it was drowned out by the brutal truth in this place. Under the hands of these uniformed men, no law could protect her. And just as consciousness left her, she realized that "here I am, the law" was not just one man's arrogance, but a sentence hanging over anyone who didn't belong to the world they ruled. A breeze swept through the alley, catching a few pages of the folder and sending them skidding along the ground, flipping through notes on symptoms, prescriptions, appointments, scraps of memory scattered by the wind left for no one to keep. Mark and his two partners faded into the darkness at the end of the alley, leaving behind damp pavement and a heavy silence. Somewhere in the distance, a motorbike buzzed away, a dog barked, but no one came to see what had just happened. At the corner of the alley, a small security camera hung its red light blinking faintly, recording everything without the power to stop it. Just like those who would later watch this footage, they would see and they would turn away. And in that very moment, a seed of hatred and hunger for justice was planted, waiting to grow into the storm that would tear down every man who once believed he was the law. The suburban train station at night felt like a place forgotten. Faint yellow light from old hanging bulbs cast patchy streaks across rain-soaked tiles. The soft, steady patter of rain on the tin roof sent heavy drops sliding off the edge into puddles below, each one landing with a dull splash like the slow heartbeat of someone fading. In that scattered light and darkness, a few rotten wooden benches sat abandoned, their paint peeling, the smell of mildew rising and mixing with the cold draft slipping through cracks in the walls. From one corner of the platform, a distant train whistle echoed, stretched out like a mournful sigh, announcing a departure that took some away and left others trapped in the night. Ethan sat on a bench, head low, hands clasped tightly as if holding on to a fragile thread to keep from slipping into the pit of exhaustion. He had just finished a shift at the wood shop, his body coated in sawdust and paint fumes, jacket stained with specks of oil. The phone in his pocket buzzed, jolting him. The screen showed Samuel Grace's father. He answered, and all he heard was a voice torn and broken, each word shredded from the throat. "Grace, she's not coming home." For a moment, Ethan's mind went blank, and every sound around him seemed to vanish. He opened his mouth to ask, but Samuel had already hung up, leaving behind the cold, flat tone of disconnection. A chill shot down his spine. Ethan jumped up, rushing out of the station, driven by something primal. His footsteps slammed against the wet tile, echoing through the empty space, merging with the sound of rain. The run from the station to the night market usually took nearly 15 minutes, but tonight he felt no sense of time, only the pounding of his heart and the breath tearing through his lungs. Images of Grace in her blue scrubs, sweat on her brow after a shift, that tired but warm smile flickered in and out like ghosts he tried to hold but couldn't. The alley behind the night market glistened with rain. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the stench of trash and dampness, forming a heavy suffocating smell that overpowered everything. When Ethan reached it, the neon light at the far end still flickered, casting a dim glow on Samuel, who was kneeling on the ground, his shoulders shaken. His arms were wrapped around Grace, holding her close, as if his warmth could bring her back. Her blue blouse was soaked in blood, stained with uneven, dark red patches. Her hair hung wet, tangled, streaked with rain. Her face was pale, eyelids half closed like she was asleep, but the stillness of her body made it clear to anyone watching she would never open her eyes again. Ethan froze for a beat, his whole body stiff. Rain lashed against his face, but he didn't blink, just stood there and stared at the scene, letting every detail burn into his memory like a scar that would never fade. Each second was a needle through his chest. He stepped forward slowly, knees weak, hand trembling as he touched Samuel's shoulder. The old man looked up, eyes bloodshot, tears mixing with the rain as they streamed down his cheeks, lips moving without sound. His gaze was a cold blade straight into Ethan's heart, not to blame him, but to carve in the brutal truth Grace was gone and nothing could undo it. As Ethan moved closer to hold his wife's cold body, a hand suddenly pressed hard against his chest, shoving him back. It was a young officer, lean, boyish face, but eyes cold as steel. His voice cut in firm and flat. "This is a crime scene. Step away." The words hit Ethan like a hammer. For a second, he thought he misheard because the tone was so casual, like asking someone to move away from a puddle, not from the body of their own wife. Ethan stood tall, took one step forward, and his eyes locked onto that icy stare. "Crime scene of my wife. Say it right." His voice dropped, not loud, not yelling, but heavy enough to stretch the space between them to a breaking point. The officer didn't answer, but his hand pressed harder against Ethan's chest, a warning that this was a line he was not allowed to cross. Under the flickering neon light, their eyes met, one filled with a storm, barely held back, the other blank and cold like the moldy brick walls of the alley itself. Samuel finally let go of Grace, his trembling hands lowering her to the ground as if all strength had drained from him. He stood up, leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. His eyes never left his daughter, but they didn't look at Ethan either. The whole space thickened with silence, broken only by rain and the drip of water from the eaves into puddles now stained red. In the distance, an ambulance pulled up, blue and red lights flashing against the stained walls. But the sound of the siren felt like it came from another world unreachable in this moment. Ethan stepped back, eyes fixed on Grace's face. In that moment, memories rushed in like a fast-forwarded reel the first time they met at a corner cafe. The awkward handshake when he introduced himself, her soft laugh every time he fumbled a story the morning of their wedding when she looked back at him before walking into the church. It all flashed by and was gone, leaving only the image of Grace lying there in this filthy, frozen alley. He knew he needed to say something, ask something, demand an answer, but every word seemed stuck in his throat, unable to break free. His eyes turned again to the young officer, blocking the way, trying to read something behind that blank expression, but all he saw was an endless void. That was the moment Ethan realized the truth about Grace's death wouldn't come easily, and maybe these men in uniform were the first wall he would have to break through. The rain kept falling, but in Ethan's mind it no longer sounded normal. It was like the slow, heavy beat of a drum announcing something about to begin. He looked at Grace one last time, didn't kiss her forehead, didn't touch her cold hand, just let his eyes say everything in silence. Then he turned and walked out of the alley, each step driving another nail into his resolve. Behind him, Samuel's sobs choked in his throat, mixing with the rustling of Grace's fallen papers, still soaked in the puddle, the ink smearing in the rain. Ethan knew the night wouldn't end here. The freezing rain and the officer's empty stare had planted something else inside him, a seed of rage he'd never known before. And he would feed it until one day it became strong enough to shatter the walls that stood between him and the truth. The police station sat at the end of an old brick-paved street, its concrete walls painted a dingy gray-yellow from dust and exhaust, looking like a giant block of stone rising from the city's core. The rain hadn't stopped, moisture clung thick to the steps and fogged up the glass doors, warping the streetlights outside into twisting streaks of light. Ethan stepped inside where the smell of old sweat, strong coffee, and damp paperwork hit him all at once, given the sense that time here had stopped, placed only by routines and rigid rules endlessly turning in place. A long, narrow hallway led to the interrogation room, Ethan's footsteps echoing on the tile, joining the sound of boots from passing officers. The flickering fluorescent lights above stretched and distorted his shadow along the walls as if even his reflection was being swallowed by this place. A duty officer sat behind a wooden desk just outside the room, a man in his 30s with a shaved head, sharp features and narrow eyes that never stopped scanning. Ethan approached and asked to see Mark Rayner. The officer didn't look up right away, flipped through a few files, then finally lifted his gaze with a crooked smile and a drawl thick with mockery. "What for an autograph. The moment the question left his mouth, Ethan could feel the contempt behind each syllable. It wasn't a real question. It was a dismissal, putting him in the place of an outsider with nothing worth saying. He let the silence settle, let the condescension hang in the air, then answered in a low, steady voice, hard as tempered steel. I want to hear him explain. He didn't wait for a response. He held the officer's gaze, and even with the smirk still curling his lips, the man went quiet for a few seconds. The door behind the officer opened, and Mark Rayner walked in, unhurried but full of confidence. Arms crossed over his chest, his tall frame nearly filled the doorway. The harsh white light from above cut across his face, outlining sharp features, but the glint in his eyes held no trace of justice. It was the look of someone who knew exactly where he stood in the chain of power. He smiled, the kind of smile that made everything happening feel like a temporary amusement. You think they'll believe you over me? Mark said, his voice echoing through the narrow room like a statement, not a question. Ethan felt each word fall like a stone into water, sending out small ripples that spread wide, each one carrying insult, defiance, and denial. He stepped toward the table in the center of the room, placing both hands on its ice-cold surface. The anger, simmering since the night before, surged like a flood, but he didn't let it explode into shout. Instead, he slammed the table, once the sound echoing through the room, rattling the thin walls. He leaned in close to Mark, shrinking the space between them until they could feel each other's breath. Believe me, no, but they'll believe what I bring. His voice was low and slow, but every word drove like a nail into the silence, cracking the smugness still clinging to Mark's mouth. For a moment, Mark's eyes flickered with a flash of caution, a rare light breaking through his calm mask. It was instinct, like a wild animal sensing its prey might be hiding a blade, but he quickly buried it beneath a dry smile, tilting his head as if he'd just heard a weak joke. He loosened his shoulders, drew a quiet breath, then leaned back in his chair again, arms folded, gaze brushing past Ethan with unmistakable arrogance. The fluorescent light above cast shifting patches of brightness and shadow across their faces, turning the room into a small stage watched by an invisible audience. In the air, the smell of old paper printer ink and the sharp sting of disinfectant mixed into something unpleasant, forcing focus onto the person across rather than the space itself. Ethan held his stare, tracking every flicker on Mark's face, memorizing how he tucked fear behind a smile. He knew he wouldn't break this man in one encounter, but he also saw clearly Mark understood now that this wouldn't end here. The desk officer from earlier still sat silently behind his post, but his eyes occasionally flicked over as if to confirm things hadn't slipped out of control. Outside the closed door, phones rang, keyboards clacked, shoes tapped on tile, all faint and distant like background noise from another world, disconnected from the quiet duel unfolding inside. Ethan leaned slightly still, watching Mark as if burning every twitch, every smirk into memory, to one day turn it all into evidence. Mark answered with a lazy shrug, but in those cold brown eyes that flicker of caution hadn't fully vanished. It had only retreated into the dark, waiting for another moment to surface. Ethan stepped back half a pace, not to retreat from the confrontation, but to see Mark from far enough away to take in the whole picture. The silence between them stretched unbroken by rushed words or unnecessary movements. In that stillness, Ethan felt one thing clearly. No matter how confident Mark was, he had realized a truth: the man standing before him would not be cornered like the others. And if this was the opening act, what followed wouldn't stay confined to four walls. It would spill out where the entire city could see. In that narrow, windowless room, two men stood at opposite ends of a battle they both knew had no truce. And in the moment their eyes met one last time before parting, Ethan knew he had lit a fire Mark couldn't put out, and Mark understood that from this point forward every step he took would be shadowed by someone watching in silence. The cemetery sat on a low hillside, the path leading up covered in fallen leaves, the scent of damp earth and wild grass rising with every step. It had been pouring since morning, cold gusts blowing up from the foot of the hill slapping against faces, forcing eyes to squint just to see ahead. Beneath umbrellas speckled in black and gray, a few people stood in a row, silent like statues. Each time a shovel of dirt hit the coffin, the dull thud blended with the rain, echoing across the empty space like a bell, tolling the end of something that could never be undone. The dark wood coffin sank slowly into the grave. Raindrops clung to its surface, trailing down in thin lines like cold tears. Ethan stood at the edge of the pit shoulders, heavy hand, gripping the umbrella so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't remember how long he'd been there, only that each clump of fallen dirt felt like another weight on his chest. Beside him, Samuel stood with his head bowed, hands folded at his waist, shivering slightly in the chill. No one spoke. Any words of comfort felt meaningless in the face of a loss like this. Neighbors, friends, and Grace's colleagues stepped forward one by one to lay down the final flowers. White lilies, pale yellow chrysanthemums, and soft lavender mixed under the rain, every petal soaked limp, as if bearing the weight of grief. Ethan watched it all without really seeing, his mind swallowed in a dense, unreachable fog. As the crowd began to thin, a figure approached from behind. It was a woman Ethan didn't know long. Brown hair tied low, a dark wool coat hiding most of her frame. Her steps were slow, but her eyes were steady, as if she had come with a purpose. She stopped in front of Ethan, said nothing at first, then extended her hand. In her palm was a small black USB drive scratched along the edges. Her voice was soft as breath, nearly drowned by the rain, but Ethan caught every word. "No one can know I gave this to you." Her icy hand brushed his for a moment before pulling back as if afraid of being seen. Without waiting for a question, she turned and walked quickly down the slope, her small frame fading into the misty rain. Ethan looked at the USB in his hand, feeling like he was holding something both fragile and heavy, a secret powerful enough to shift everything. He slipped it into his inner coat pocket, his fingers tightening around it as if trying to preserve its warmth until he could find the truth. That afternoon, the wind kept whipping through the trees on the hill, wet leaves rustling into a low, endless whisper. Ethan left the cemetery alone, walking the muddy path back to town. Each step sank into the earth, leaving deep imprints that the rain quickly washed away. He returned to the small guest house at the end of a narrow street where he had been staying since the night Grace died. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, and the familiar damp smell of the room welcomed him in. Ethan hung up his coat, pulled the USB from his pocket, and placed it on the small wooden table by the window. He grabbed his old laptop, wiped off the raindrops still clinging to the surface, and plugged in the USB. The screen flickered, showing a single untitled file, a video icon. He double-clicked it, and a burst of static came through before the image appeared. The video was blurry and shaky, likely recorded from a hidden angle with a small device. In the frame, he recognized the alley behind the night market, the place where it all began. The neon lights flickered, and the shadows of three men appeared, one of them clearly Mark Rayner. Even without sharp detail, Ethan could make out his confident stance and slow, deliberate steps. Grace entered the frame, holding her folder, saying something just before Mark lunged and grabbed her wrist. The footage shook violently, but it still caught the motion of him shoving her hard into the wall. A voice cut in unclear if it was a warning or a taunt, followed by the heavy echoing thud of something hitting the ground. Ethan sat frozen eyes locked on the screen, each frame burning away what little calm he had left. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from anger rising in waves spreading through every part of him. The video ended abruptly, the screen going dark, reflecting his face in the dim yellow light. In his eyes was the cold focus of someone who had just found the first piece of a puzzle far darker than he imagined. He leaned back in the chair, fingers tapping lightly on the tabletop. It wasn't just Mark. The video didn't clearly show the other faces, but Ethan knew it wouldn't be hard to find out. The way they stood watched and said nothing as Grace was attacked told him everything. They weren't just complicit. They were part of a system that had existed long enough to act boldly in public and believe no one would dare challenge them. Ethan leaned forward, shut the laptop, and picked up the USB. The cold metal stuck to his skin, a sharp reminder that this was only the beginning. He clenched his fist, blood rushing to his knuckles until it hurt. Not just him. All of them will pay. The words broke out into the empty room, echoed off the damp walls, and then faded into silence. But for Ethan, the sentence had become a vow, and once made he wouldn't stop until every last one of them bowed before the truth. The small room where Ethan had been staying since the funeral sat on the second floor of an old row house, its walls peeling in patches, the air filled with the smell of mildew and wood dust, a scent that seemed soaked into every brick. A yellowed ceiling bulb hung loosely in the center, casting a dim light that couldn't reach the corners, leaving the space feeling both cramped and cold. Night wind slipped through the cracked window, stirring the faded curtain, its soft rustle blending with the rain outside to form a weary hum. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. In front of him was the bare wall where he had decided to place what would become the center of everything. He took a wedding photo of himself and Grace from his coat pocket, the one that had once sat in a dark wooden frame they picked out together on a quiet weekend afternoon before the ceremony. In the photo, Grace wore a white dress, her soft smile tilted toward him, her eyes holding a gentle light he had never seen in anyone else. He, in a simple suit, had one hand on her back, his gaze locked on her as if trying to hold that moment forever. Now, that moment was just a picture, but to Ethan, it was a reminder he couldn't ignore. He hung the photo in the center of the wall, adjusted it until it was perfectly level. Beneath it, he placed the small black USB the strange woman had given him at the funeral, a tiny object that carried the full weight of an unspoken truth. He sat down at the wooden desk by the window, opened his old laptop, the screen flickering to life slowly. Ethan began searching. His fingers moved quickly across the keys, entering keywords, names, and dates into the search bar. Old news articles, brief reports, lines of text that once seemed meaningless now appeared, and under his focused gaze, they began to link together into a network. He jotted notes into a worn leather notebook. Each name he wrote becoming a red dot on the mental map of those who had to pay. Messy lines filled the page, officer names, badge numbers, incident dates, and fragments about victims. He flipped through pages, comparing them with memories of the video with the shadowed figures behind Mark in that dark alley. They weren't strangers. They were names that had shown up in headlines as heroes after arresting suspects or dedicated officers who helped contain riots. But when he dug deeper, leaked internal reports and anonymous forum posts painted another picture: beatings, random arrests, threats aimed at the local black community. On page 13 of the notebook, Ethan underlined the name Mark Rayner 3 times. Below it was a list of incidents Mark was either present at or directly involved in, stretching back years, and strangely, most had never led to prosecution. When he connected the cases, Ethan saw a chilling pattern. Nearly all involved at least one of the same faces captured in the USB video. This was no longer the rogue actions of a single officer. It was organized, a group shielded by the very people sworn to uphold the law. The pen in Ethan's hand paused. He leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the list in front of him. In the yellowish glow of the overhead bulb, the lines he'd written looked like carvings in stone, rigid and permanent. His breath slowed, but lost its rhythm, as if each inhale drove the blade of resolve deeper into his chest. The room was so quiet, he could hear his own heartbeat pulsing in time with the wind outside the window. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but each name on that list marked a step he had to take, a face he would one day confront. His eyes returned to the wedding photo on the wall. Grace's face still held that smile, the one that warmed his heart and broke it all at once. For a brief moment, memories surged back her voice, the gentle touch she used to calm him, the soft scent of her hair. But they vanished, as quickly replaced by the image of her in the video, eyes, wide hand raised in defense, the cold fall onto concrete. Ethan stood, walked up to the photo, and his gaze turned sharp. "No one's going to protect you anymore," he muttered, his voice low and steady, not meant to be heard but delivered like a sentence passed down to those on the list. Each word dropped heavy as stone echoing through the tight room. This wasn't anger flaring up. It was conviction, settled and honed into a blade. Ethan turned back to the desk, closed the notebook, and placed it beside the USB as if lining up pieces of a weapon. The yellow bulb still cast its tired light, but in his eyes there was something else, a cold, steady fire that nothing could shake. Outside, the faint sound of traffic drifted through the window, a reminder that the world was carrying on as usual. But for Ethan, everything had changed. He had chosen a path, and he would follow it to the end, no matter how dark or bloody it became. The Internet Cafe sat deep in an alley of a working-class neighborhood, its exterior marked by faded paint and weather-worn signs bleached by sun and rain. The sputter of motorbikes outside blended with the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, carrying the damp, acrid smell of burning trash. The glass door was fogged from the temperature difference, and each time someone opened it, cold air rushed in, mixing with the thick scents of sweat, instant noodles, and drifting cigarette smoke. Rows of computers lined up side by side, screens casting a flickering blue-white glow across faces bent low over keyboards. The air buzzed with keystrokes, rapid mouse clicks, and the occasional curse shouted from a corner when someone lost a game. Ethan sat near the back in a dim corner lit by a single weak fluorescent bulb, enough to see the keyboard but not enough to draw attention. The black USB lay next to his hand, a weight he had carried since the funeral. On screen was the login page of an anonymous forum, its dark interface plain, the kind only those who knew how to find it could access. He opened the video again, eyes scanning the shaky, grainy footage, still clear enough to make out Mark's face and posture. His movements, the hard shove Grace's body hitting the ground, each frame cut like a blade into memory. Ethan moved the cursor to the upload button, then paused for a few seconds. In his mind echoed the voice of the woman at the cemetery, soft, as if afraid the wind would steal it away. "No one can know I gave this to you." Her warning wasn't meant to stop him, only to remind him that once the video was out, there would be no turning back. Once it was public, there would be people coming, not to help, but to silence. He took a deep breath, then clicked upload. The progress bar crept forward, each percent passing with the beat of his heart. When it finished, he typed a short caption, "See who's protecting you." No name, no address, no extra details, just the video left to speak for itself. He hit post. The screen blinked once, then reloaded the video, now pinned to the top of the feed, its dark thumbnail enough to make anyone curious. Click. At first, the view count climbed slowly, dozens, then hundreds, but within 10 minutes it began ticking up by the second. Ethan watched the comment thread scroll fast, lines of text pouring in. "That's him. I saw him on 8th Street. Can't believe they did this. Needs to be investigated now. This is why I never trusted the cops in this district." The outrage spread like fire on dry leaves. Each comment a spark catching the next, swelling into a storm of voices, tearing through the cover Mark had hidden behind for so long. News of the video didn't take long to break out of the forum. Some users downloaded it, reposted it across social media platforms, tagging local news outlets and community groups. Within an hour, images of Mark and Grace had flooded the timelines of hundreds of people, accompanied by calls for investigation and newly forming hashtags repeating over and over. Ethan sat there, eyes locked on the screen, but he felt no relief. He knew this was only the first tap against a very thick wall. On the other side of the city, Mark Rayner had surely heard the news. That afternoon, a local news site published a short article with a photo of Mark standing in front of the police station, his face stern, but his eyes still carrying that familiar confidence. A quote from him read, "This is a fake video staged to smear my reputation and career. I will take legal action against anyone spreading it." Short, cold, and clearly a warning. Ethan read the article in another tab, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smile, not of joy, but at the confirmation that Mark had been forced to respond. A man truly confident wouldn't rush to deny something unless he felt the threat was real. That night, as the video continued to spread, the popular blogger, known for exposing police scandals, shared it. In a long post, he called Mark a cancer in the force, comparing him to a malignant tumor, not only rotting those around him, but threatening to spread through the entire system if not removed. The post quickly racked up tens of thousands of shares, with hundreds of comments fanning the flames, recounting personal stories of abuse and misconduct they had witnessed or experienced. Ethan sat in the corner of the internet cafe, watching it all unfold. The light of the screen reflected in his eyes not just the screen's glow, but the spark of a fire taking hold. He could feel the power of information once released, once it left his hands and spread into thousands of other devices. Every view, every share was a new heartbeat in the campaign he had begun. But he also knew the more people who saw it, the more others would start digging to find out who had let the secret out. The sound of keys clacking continued around him. Laughter and curses from gamers who had no idea what was unfolding beyond their screens. In the corner, an old fan turned slowly, humming in a steady whine. Ethan took a sip of coffee from a paper cup, the bitterness and warmth pulling him back into the moment. He knew he couldn't stay long, but he didn't get up yet. He wanted to watch a little longer to make sure the story had grown large enough that it couldn't be buried so easily. When the screen showed the view count passing 10,000 in under 2 hours, Ethan shut the computer, slipped the USB back into his coat pocket. He stood up and walked out of the cafe, the doorbell chiming softly behind him as the cold air outside wrapped around his body. The rain had eased, and puddles on the street reflected the glow of street lights into shimmering streaks of gold. He kept walking, knowing that from this point on the game had changed, not just his pain anymore, but the rising anger of a community that had been waiting for an excuse to stand up, and he had given them that excuse. The central square in the late afternoon was soaked in a thick gray hue, the sky holding a heavy block of leaden clouds overhead ready to break open at any moment. The old buildings surrounding the square stood silent, their windows reflecting the last light of day like hundreds of eyes quietly watching. On the wide stone pavement, clusters of people had already gathered, faces marked with anger, resolve, exhaustion, but never doubt. They held up cardboard prints of Grace's photo, her eyes staring straight into the lens as if looking through the crowd, and beneath them, large, hand-lettered signs. Justice for Grace. Stop police brutality. We are watching. The bold ink stood out on the whiteboard, the jagged handwriting burning under the dark amber sky. Ethan stood near the center, surrounded by a sea of people and flags fluttering lightly in the wind. He wore a dark coat, arms at his sides, his gaze fixed on the police headquarters across the square. His eyes didn't blink, as if trying to pierce the concrete walls, the glass doors, and the darkened halls to find the faces he had written in his notebook. Around him, chants began to rise steady and strong, joined by the beat of hands on drums and the rhythm of feet stomping the stone ground. The air was thick with sweat, the plastic smell of signs and exhaust drifting in from a nearby street, all of it fueling the tension running through everybody there. Across the square, a line of patrol cars had pulled in, lights flashing red and blue against the building facades. A unit of officers stepped out, clad in black body armor helmets, covering their heads, shields gleaming under the streetlights. Batons gripped tightly in hand, they formed a wall, moving slowly but evenly forward, a mobile barrier pressing closer toward the crowd. The already tense atmosphere grew denser. The lead voices chanting faltered slightly, but their eyes still burned with fire. Ethan didn't move, his eyes locked on the advancing officers. He heard someone beside him shout, "Hold the line, don't move back." A few people raised their phones toward the police, capturing each step, each cold stare behind the face shields. When the gap narrowed to just a few meters, a commanding officer signaled, and the line raised their shields in unison, advancing faster, baton swinging forward, striking arms, shoulders, protest, sign. The dry, sharp clash of plastic and metal echoed across the square. The crowd pushed backward, screams breaking out in every direction, flags and signs tilting, some crushed underfoot. In the chaos, Ethan saw a woman at the front shoved hard by a shield, stumbling and falling onto the stone ground, her Justice for Grace sign slipping from her hand and sliding away into the surge of bodies. One officer raised his baton, the motion quick and detached like a task repeated many times before. Without thinking, Ethan lunged forward, shoulder slamming into the shield ahead, hand catching the woman and pulling her out of the baton's path. The hard plastic stick sliced through the air where they had just stood. He stepped in front of her, eyes locked on the officer who had struck, voice rising in a shout that echoed off the square's walls. One more down. The words landed like a blade, cutting through the noise, casting a brief silence over the space between both sides. The woman he'd pulled back was still trembling with fear. Nearby, several people raised their phones, cameras pointed at Ethan and the officer. The chants erupted again, louder, no longer in rhythm, but crashing like waves. From a distance, someone began shouting Grace's name, and the crowd responded in unison. The name rang out again and again like a bell, waking people up, reminding them why they stood here beneath a darkening sky and in front of a wall of cold batons. The police line kept closing in, but the pressure from the cameras and the rising chants made a few officers hesitate. Ethan felt it clear as day, and he knew he had touched the nerve that Mark and those behind him would hate most: public exposure, something they couldn't fully control. He stepped back, eyes still locked on the shield's, heart pounding but breath steady, because he understood this fight had left the shadows of the police station and become a battle played out in full view at the city's center. For a moment, light rain began to fall, tiny droplets mixing with sweat and dust on every face, but no one moved. The rain only thickened the air, its chill clinging to skin like a second layer, alongside the tension and rising resolve. Ethan turned his head, scanning the crowd, seeing hundreds of eyes fixed on the line of police, and he knew this wave wouldn't stop in the square tonight. It would spread, and he would be in the center of it, pushing it further until the truth was forced into the light. The central square in the late afternoon was covered in a thick gray hue, the sky holding a heavy block of leaden clouds above, ready to burst at any moment. The old buildings surrounding the square stood still, their windows reflecting the day's last light like hundreds of quiet eyes watching. On the wide stone pavement, groups of people had gathered, their faces a mix of emotions, anger, determination, fatigue, but no hesitation. They held up cardboard prints of Grace's photo, her eyes staring straight into the lens as if looking through the crowd, and beneath them, large, handwritten signs. Justice for Grace, stop. Police brutality, we are watching. The bold ink stood out against the white board, the uneven letters burning like fire under the darkening sunset. Ethan stood near the center, surrounded by the sea of people and rows of flags fluttering softly in the wind. He wore a dark coat, arms hanging loosely at his sides, his eyes fixed on the police headquarters across the square. His gaze didn't blink, as if trying to bore through the concrete walls, through the glass doors and dim corridors, searching for the faces he had written in his notebook. Around him, chants began to rise strong and steady, mixed with the beat of hands on drums and the rhythm of feet stomping the stone ground. The air was thick with sweat, the smell of plastic signs and car exhaust drifting in from the nearby street, heavy but charged with the tension running through every person there. Across the square, a line of patrol cars parked bumper to bumper, their flashing red and blue lights sweeping across building facades. A row of police officers stepped out, clad in black body armor helmets covering their heads, shields gleaming under the street lamps. Batons, gripped firmly in hand. They lined up, shoulder to shoulder, moving slowly and evenly forward a mobile wall, pressing toward the crowd. The atmosphere, already taut, tightened further. The front line chants faltered slightly, but their eyes still burned with intensity. Ethan didn't move, his eyes locked on the advancing officers. He heard someone beside him shout, "Hold the line! Don't back up." A few people raised their phones. Cameras aimed at the police recording every step, every cold glance behind the face shields. When the gap had narrowed to just a few meters, a signal was given. The officers raised their shields in unison and stepped forward faster, batons swinging out, striking arms, shoulders, protest signs. The dry clatter of plastic and metal echoed sharply through the square. The crowd was pushed backward, screams echoing across the square, flags and signs tilting, some trampled underfoot. In the chaos, Ethan saw a woman at the front shoved hard by a shield, losing her balance and falling onto the stone ground, her Justice for Grace sign slipping from her hands and sliding through the surge of people. An officer raised his baton, the movement quick and cold, like a task repeated too many times. Without thinking, Ethan charged forward, shoulders slamming into the shield, his hand catching the woman and pulling her out of the baton's arc. The sound of wind ripped past as the hard plastic rod struck the spot they had just vacated. He stepped in front of her eyes, locked on the officer who had attacked his voice, rising in a shout that bounced off the square's walls. One more down. The words cut through the noise like a blade, dropping a moment of silence over the space between both sides. The woman he'd pulled back was still shaking with fear. A few nearby raised their phones to record cameras focusing on Ethan and the officer. The chants surged louder, no longer rhythmic, crashing in waves. From somewhere in the distance, someone called out Grace's name, and the crowd answered in unison. Her name rang out over and over, like a bell striking awake the memory of why they were there beneath a darkened sky and in front of a wall of batons. The police line kept moving forward, but the pressure of cameras and the swelling voices made a few hesitate. Ethan felt it clearly, and he knew he'd touched something Mark and those behind him wouldn't like public light, the one thing they couldn't fully control. He took a step back, his eyes still locked on the shield's heart pounding, but breath steady because he knew this fight had broken out of the dark walls of the precinct and become a public confrontation at the heart of the city. In that moment, light rain began to fall, small droplets mixing with sweat and dust on every face, but no one left. The rain only thickened the air, its chill clinging to skin like a second layer alongside the tension and determination surging in every chest. Ethan turned his head, scanning the square, seeing hundreds of eyes fixed on the police line, and he knew this wave wouldn't stop here tonight. It would keep rising, and he would be in the middle of it, pushing it further until the truth was forced into the light. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering blue-white glow of 3 screens in front of Ethan, casting shifting shadows across his face. The steady sound of frantic typing filled the space, each keystroke like a drumbeat, everyone loaded with determination. On one screen, local news sites displayed headlines disturbingly similar. Nurse Grace Miller, tied to drug ring, internal source claims Grace linked to West End crime group. The articles used old photos of Grace, cropped and dimmed to appear shadowy, evoking suspicion. At the bottom, anonymous sources were quoted vague, but enough to plant doubt in the minds of readers. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes still locked on the screen. He knew this tactic target the reputation and dignity of the dead to splinter public opinion, stir doubt, and eventually make people move on. They wanted to turn Grace from a victim into a villain, and if left unanswered, everything he and others had built would crumble in days. He reached over to the second screen where he kept dozens of files gathered over weeks, leaked internal reports, dismissed testimonies, emails proving Mark and his team had covered for each other, even altered evidence to escape consequences. He began sorting, cross-referencing each document, marking dates, and connecting events to build a coherent timeline. Each entry was written concisely, paired with photos of original documents, official red stamps still visible. On the third screen, he opened an anonymous social media account where hashtags linked to Grace were exploding. He watched trending phrases noted which were being repeated the most and began planning his counterattack. If they were going to twist the truth with headlines, he would use the same platforms to pull it back into the light. His first post was short and struck directly a photo of an internal report from a 2020 assault case with Mark Rayner's name at the top of the officer list, captioned, "They call this justice." Beneath it, he added the hashtags #WhoProtectsUs and #Justice for Grace. Within 10 minutes, the post began to spread, each share followed by comments and stories from people who'd been stopped by Mark's team, had their IDs checked without reason, or had been detained without warrants. Ethan didn't stop. Every few minutes, he posted new evidence, a screenshot of an internal email ordering adjustments to a witness statement, a duty roster strangely aligned with multiple assault incidents, a photo of a report with entire sections about seized security footage crossed out. Each post carried the same hashtags, and soon, #Justice for Grace climbed into local trending ranks while #WhoProtectsUs started appearing in neighboring cities. On screen, the comment feed streamed non-stop. Many expressed outrage at the evidence, while others began mentioning Mark by name and calling for old cases to be reopened. A few independent journalists got involved, messaging Ethan's account to request more data. He responded briefly, sending them the files he had prepared, fully aware that once the information was verified by other sources, its impact would grow beyond the control of the local police force. The night passed in the constant sound of keystrokes, sweat gathering on Ethan's forehead, even with the window cracked open to let in the cold air. He didn't feel tired. Each step of the counterattack seemed to pump more energy into his body. Every time a fabricated article about Grace appeared, he posted a new piece of evidence. Every time someone tried to discredit her in the comments, he responded with undeniable images and data. Slowly, the tide of public opinion began to shift. More comments defended Grace, and people who had stayed silent were now speaking up. When the clock neared 4 a.m., Ethan looked at the engagement stats. The hashtag #JusticeForGrace had surpassed 2 million mentions, spread into other countries thanks to the diaspora. Video clips, news articles, and testimonies had been pieced together into a full narrative. Grace was no drug deal. She was the victim of a group of abusive officers with Mark Rayner at the top. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, knowing this was just one battle in a much larger war, but it had turned the tide. Outside, the sky began to lighten, the first rays of daylight slipping through thick clouds. Ethan shut off the screens, neatly stored away the files in USB in a locked drawer. He looked out the window. Rooftops glistened with night dew like they'd just been rinsed clean, and in that brief moment he believed that truth, no matter how tarnished, would always find its way into the light. The social media war erupted more fiercely than anyone had predicted. If, in the beginning, Justice for Grace dominated entirely, then soon after the police side and their supporters launched a counter-offensive, a new wave of hashtags appeared. #Protect. Our cops crept into every post, every thread. The two opposing phrases stood side by side on trending charts. One, a cry for justice, the other a shield for those in uniform. The debates turned fierce, no longer confined to Grace's case, but evolving into a battle of ideologies, questioning faith and corruption within the law enforcement system. On the forums, thousands of new posts appeared every hour, many just to argue, refute, or mock the opposing side. Some anonymous accounts released doctored images and edited clips to smear the hashtag Justice for Grace movement, labeling it a fabricated campaign to undermine law enforcement, while Grace's supporters countered with original videos, verified evidence, and real-life stories from victims of police violence. Each rebuttal was shared by hundreds, often accompanied by warnings to stay alert against disinformation. Ethan monitored everything from his small rented room, the glow from 3 monitors blending together images, graphs, and breaking news. He didn't engage in every debate, instead focusing on carefully timed releases of new data. An internal report about an evidence cover-up from 3 years ago. An audio recording of Mark speaking with another officer about adjusting a witness statement. Ethan released them just as #ProtectOurCops began gaining momentum again, immediately shaking public opinion. The press got involved. TV commentators hosted live debates where both sides sat across from each other, throwing out arguments and evidence in ways that kept viewers glued to their screens. Some journalists who had kept their distance began leaning toward the call for an investigation as the volume of evidence became too great to dismiss as a coincidence. Headlines started asking, who really protects us and how many cases like Grace's have we never heard about? Public pressure built to the point where city officials could no longer remain silent. On Tuesday morning, the mayor appeared in the press room at City Hall, his face tense but trying to remain composed. Behind him were the national flag and the city banner camera lights flickering, and as he stepped up to the podium, his voice came through the mic clear and measured. Given the current situation, and in the interest of complete transparency, I hereby announce an independent investigation into the allegations involving Officer Mark Rayner and any associated individuals. That statement was instantly turned into headlines by the media, the video replayed thousands of times on social platforms, shared with the hashtag #JusticeForGrace as a key milestone. Those who had gathered at the Central Square that day cheered, and in online groups hundreds of comments expressed relief and hope. Still, Ethan knew this wasn't a victory yet. Even an independent investigation could be swayed unless he and those supporting him kept public attention shining on the truth. That night, he sat alone by the window, looking down at the rain-soaked street washed in yellow lamplight. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and notifications, but Ethan left it on the table. In his mind, new pieces were starting to fall into place: the witness list, the cases never made public, the names already mentioned in old files. He knew that from now on every step would have to move faster, with more urgency, because time was no longer on his side. The hashtag war had moved beyond screens, becoming real pressure, weighing down on the entire power structure. And Ethan understood that once this wheel was set in motion, he had to be the one to keep it from stopping. Midday sun poured over the narrow street like a mesh of fire heat rising off the pavement made the air shimmer. On both sides stood old buildings, their walls chipped and stained with faded paint, windows cracked open to catch whatever breeze might come, though it only carried the burnt tang of asphalt. Ethan walked along the sidewalk, his shadow stretching at his feet, his mind still echoing with the data files and images he'd reviewed earlier that morning. The crunch of his shoes over dry gravel sounded faint but sharp in the oppressive stillness of the empty street. At the bend, a man's silhouette appeared, casting a broad shadow across the narrow strip of sunlight between the buildings. Mark Rayner was on patrol, walking slowly, one hand on his radio, the other resting near his belt. He stopped when he saw Ethan, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his cap, then his mouth curled into a smirk full of contempt. The sun caught the edge of his badge in a glare, but it was Mark's expression that drew Ethan's attention, the look of someone convinced he stood above, able to crush anyone beneath him. The distance was covered in a few steps. Mark stopped, tilted his head slightly as if gauging Ethan's reaction. He spoke, voice low, and stretched each word sharpened with malice. "You should be thankful I didn't send you to join your wife." For a moment, the air seemed to freeze, and the far-off sound of a fan from inside someone's house suddenly grew clear, mingling mingled with the soft creak of a metal gate swinging shut. The words slid into Ethan's ear like a cold needle, piercing the deepest layers of rage he had carried for so long. Ethan halted, shoulders tensing. His breathing slowed, but his heart pounded, every pulse thudding like a drum. He locked eyes with Mark, gaze cold and dark, as if burning the man's image into memory. The sounds of the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the charged silence between them. Mark kept smiling as though enjoying a petty game, unaware that Ethan's quiet was not retreat, but the calm before the storm. The noon sun kept pouring down, casting pale gold streaks across the cracked pavement. A faint breeze swept through, but it couldn't ease the heat building inside Ethan. Mark's words still rang in his ears, but instead of replaying them, Ethan let them dissolve into the rising tide of resolve. In that moment, everything became clear. This was no longer about online exchanges, not about files or hashtags, but raw confrontation where a single sentence could ignite everything. Ethan took one step forward, the space between them now only a few handspans. The scent of sweat-hot asphalt and challenge mingled in the air. He felt every taut line of muscle, each drop of sweat tracing down his temple. Mark stood there, lips parting, as if ready to throw out another taunt. But Ethan didn't give him the chance. Ethan didn't reply. His fist clenched so tight his knuckles turned white, breath pushed deep into his chest before bursting out like a surge of heat. In the instant before Mark could register the shift, Ethan's punch came up swift and heavy like the swing of an axe. The dry crack rang out as his fist connected directly with Mark's cheekbone. The impact so forceful it knocked him sideways. His breath clipped. A bright red spray burst from the corner of Mark's mouth, splattering in thick streaks across the gray sidewalk, spreading and warming quickly under the midday sun. Mark stumbled back, reeling like someone hit by an unexpected wave. His eyes widened with more shock than pain, while Ethan stood still, shoulders raised, breath sharp, his gaze sharp as a blade. The sound of the punch didn't just echo through the narrow street. It triggered a chorus of shouts from people scattered on both sides. From half-open windows, phones were immediately raised, lenses swinging to catch the moment. Some people cheered like they'd just witnessed a goal, others filmed silently, their eyes part astonished, part satisfied. The oppressive stillness of noon was ripped open, replaced by a storm of noise and attention. Mark braced against the pavement, trying to steady himself, but the red streak from his lip continued down his chin, dripping onto the ground. He growled something, but the surrounding cheers drowned it out. A few people rushed closer, not to break it up, but to get a clearer shot of the man who'd just been punched and his reaction. Ethan said nothing, only stood upright, shoulders lowered but eyes still locked on Mark, a stare that weighed heavily on the man across from him. Just hours later, the video of the punch was circulating on social media, cut from multiple angles. Some clips showed Mark's smirk in detail. Others zoomed in on Ethan's fist as it landed, the spray of blood and the burst of shouting that followed. Headlines erupted across news sites. Grace's husband punches cop in broad daylight. Justice or violence, hero or criminal. Public opinion is split like a sharp divide. Half supported Ethan, calling the act a deserved response after what Mark had done and a symbol of resistance against abused power. They shared the video with calls for unity, hashtags like #StandWithEthan and #JusticeForGrace, flooding timelines again, this time alongside the image of the punch as a kind of declaration. Supportive comments echoed the same sentiment that sometimes justice needs a direct blow to be awakened. The other side harshly criticized Ethan, calling him a violent man, someone who had crossed the line of the law. They argued that even if Mark was in the wrong, attacking a police officer was still a crime, and that act would be used to discredit the entire movement Ethan was building. Legal analysis articles began to surface, sharing the potential penalties for assaulting a public officer, raising serious questions about Ethan's future if the case went to court. As the debates grew more intense, the punch video continued to spread without pause. Mainstream news outlets invited lawyers reporters, social activists, and even former police officers to comment, each offering a different perspective from sympathy to condemnation. Reporters went to the street where the incident occurred to interview witnesses, collecting detailed accounts of Mark's attitude and Ethan's reaction, adding new layers to the story. Ethan quietly followed everything from his small apartment, the light from the screen casting shifting shadows on his face, reflected in eyes that still burned with a hard-to-define resolve. He knew his action had opened a new chapter where nothing could return to how it was, but he also understood that the punch wasn't just a burst of personal rage. It was the eruption of all the injustice he and so many others had endured, and now it had become a symbol that couldn't be erased from the memory of anyone who had seen it. The hallway of City Hall glared under fluorescent lights, but the air felt heavy like a gray cloud pressing down on everyone present. Camera shutters clicked non-stop, flashes bursting and slicing the narrow space into fragments of light and shadow. Reporters crowded the walkway's edge, microphones shoved forward, questions overlapping in a mix of footsteps and the harsh clink of metal as handcuffs tightened around Ethan's wrists. Flanked by two officers, he walked slowly but steadily, his gaze unwavering in the face of the lenses. His expression was strangely calm, as if the barrage of camera flashes couldn't pierce through the resolve wrapped around him. At the end of the hallway, Samuel stood among the crowd, rain-soaked coat damp at the shoulders, both fists clenched tight. His eyes were bloodshot, locked on Ethan's every step. In that stare was rage, pain, and a barely concealed helplessness, like he was watching a piece of his family being pulled out of reach once again. Ethan turned his head slightly, and their eyes met for a brief moment, just long enough for both to know they were still on the same side, even as the physical distance and cold metal cuffs pulled them apart. The noise grew louder as the escort passed the reporters. One shouted, "Do you regret hitting the officer?" Another cut in, "Do you think you're a hero or a criminal?" Ethan didn't respond, walking straight ahead as if those questions were nothing more than wind blowing through the corridor. Each step added weight to the story that had been building for weeks, now reaching its peak with the image of a man in handcuffs surrounded by press and public. Just as the escort prepared to turn toward the exit, a figure stepped forward from the group of attorneys. It was Ethan's lead lawyer, black briefcase in hand, his face unfazed by the chaos around him. He raised a thick, file voice, cutting through the noise with clarity. "Before my client is tried, this demand must be addressed. We call for a full investigation into the case of Grace Miller, including all misconduct by Officer Mark Rayner and any associated individuals." The statement, the thick air like a jolt, redirecting every microphone and camera toward him. Some people cheered, others began typing rapidly on laptops, pushing the update into the news stream like a fresh spark. The question shifted immediately. Is there new evidence? Will you release the files? Has the independent investigation begun? The lawyer didn't answer at once, his eyes fixed ahead, lips pressed shut, with unwavering resolve, as if to say the truth would come to light when the time was right. Ethan heard every word clearly, his shoulders straightening slightly, his steps gaining strength. Though handcuffed, he felt unmistakably that he wasn't alone. Everything he had done, releasing the video to the public, confronting Mark, and throwing that punch on the street, was now part of something bigger. The lawyer's bold demand for an investigation in front of dozens of reporters wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a statement the story wasn't over, and the trial would not revolve around a single punch. As the doors to the outside opened, a wave of cold air rushed in, carrying the damp scent of the recent rain. The crowd outside erupted, some chanting Grace's name, others holding phones high to stream the moment live. Ethan stepped down the stairs, the flash of cameras bursting again, but this time he didn't flinch, letting his image enter every lens as a message that he wouldn't disappear in silence. Behind him, Samuel remained where he was, his eyes locked on Ethan until he vanished behind the police car door. Inside, a silent vow settled deep within him. They would not let this story be buried beneath fake reports and lies. The wheels rolled across the wet pavement, water spraying up as sirens cleared the way. Inside the vehicle, Ethan Ethan leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed on the shadow ahead. The battle had entered a new phase, and he knew this time it wasn't just him. The whole city was watching. What happened at City Hall spread beyond the city like fire catching wind. Within a day, national networks covered Ethan's arrest and the demand to reopen Grace's case. Morning broadcasts ran footage of the hallway packed with reporters coding to the moment the lawyer held up the file and delivered his statement with crystal clarity. Anchors opened their segments with grave tones, stressing that this was no longer a local incident but a national issue of transparency and justice. Major publications ran detailed timelines from Grace's death to the leaked video and Ethan's punch, raising the question of how long the truth had been buried and who should be held accountable. Public pressure surged not only from Ethan's supporters but from human rights groups, police oversight organizations, and even politicians who had previously stayed silent. They called in unison for a full investigation, warning that if the authorities ignored this, public trust would collapse. On social media, familiar hashtags kept trending, joined by new ones like Investigate Mark Rayner and #TruthForGrace. Each post shared thousands of times within minutes. Mark Rayner, the man who once walked past cameras with arrogant confidence, had now become the center of a furious wave of backlash. Footage of him assaulting Grace played on repeat, intercut with the moment he took Ethan's punch. Under every article about him were thousands of angry comments, many people sharing their own stories of being harassed or mistreated by police, casting Mark as the symbol of that problem. News outlets began digging into his past, uncovering numerous suspicious incidents that had been quietly dismissed or closed without resolution, further tarnishing his image. Amid the outrage, police leadership was forced to hold a press conference. A spokesperson stood at a wooden podium, the city flag behind him, reading a statement with visible tension on his face. His voice rang out flatly. "Officer Mark Rayner will be placed on temporary suspension pending the results of the investigation. This decision is made to ensure transparency and maintain public trust." The announcement was immediately featured as breaking news, drawing mixed reactions. Some called it a necessary, though belated step, while others saw it as a weak attempt to calm the public and argued that a suspension alone couldn't undo what had been done. Ethan read the news from a digital article while sitting in a holding cell, the glow of the screen reflected across his face. He read each word carefully, noting how the article no longer referred to Mark as a model officer, but instead as a figure under investigation for alleged misconduct and abuse of power. A chill of clarity and resolve flickered in Ethan's eyes. He knew this wasn't the end, but it was a sign that the shield protecting Mark had begun to crack. Outside, Samuel and the legal team continued to meet, using the peak of public pressure to push for a deeper investigation, not just into Mark, but into the entire network behind him. Every television interview with the attorney was clipped and widely shared, drawing more national attention. The pieces of the story were coming together more clearly, and Grace's name was no longer just a symbol of one unjust case, but a rallying cry for change across the system. In the days that followed, national reporters flooded the city, crowding outside the police department, and City Hall cameras trained on every development. All eyes waited to see the government's next move, and in the shadows of the holding cell, Ethan knew that every passing second could tip the balance in his favor or against it. But, at the very least, with Mark's suspension, he had seen the first crack of light breaking through the wall he was trying to tear down. The archive was buried deep beneath the administrative building, its heavy metal door opening with a slow grinding hinge revealing a dim space thick with the scent of mold. A weak yellow light hung from the ceiling, casting shadows over steel shelves that reached up to the top, stacked with old file boxes coated in thick dust. Every footstep echoed softly as if disturbing the memory of years deliberately left forgotten. Samuel and a young attorney led the way while Ethan, his hands loosely cuffed behind his back for security, followed, his eyes scanning the faded labels on the yellowed file tabs. The archivist, a thin, middle-aged woman with thick glasses, pulled a separate key from a ring of old ones and unlocked a cabinet in the farthest corner. As the door creaked open, brown folders slid out their paper edges, curled with age. Samuel carefully slipped on gloves, pulled the first file, and laid it on a long wooden table. On the first page was Mark Rayner's name, followed by a series of internal memos, reports, and investigative notes. They turned each page slowly, the numbers and dates spanning over a decade, each documenting incidents involving Mark and allegations of misconduct. The cases repeated in cold patterns, unjustified traffic stops, excessive force, erased camera footage, and witness intimidation. What made the air heavier was the list of victims, mostly women of color from poor neighborhoods on the city's outskirts. In many reports, their statements were crossed out or marked insufficient evidence, and the cases were quietly closed without any form of accountability. The young lawyer shook his head, exhaling as he reached for a file from 5 years ago, where a woman was severely injured during an arrest only for the case to be ruled an accident during restraint. Ethan stared at the pages, a familiar but searing emotion rising within him. He recognized several faces in the attached black and white photos, people he'd met at vigils or who had messaged him after Grace's death to share their own stories. Now, the connection was undeniable. Mark wasn't just the man who shattered Ethan's life. He was part of a long, calculated chain of abuse stretching back decades, hidden and protected from consequence. Samuel handed him a thick report labeled 2012. Inside was a case involving a young woman arrested while walking home accused of suspected drug trafficking. Crime scene photos showed her bag ransacked, but the official record noted no contraband found. The case was closed with no mention of apology or restitution. Ethan felt each word like a blade carving into truth, every cut a testament to power left unchecked. The young attorney used his phone to snap pictures of each page, the camera flash flickering and casting their shadows across the surrounding file shelves. The archivist glanced nervously down the hallway and lowered her voice, reminding them to hurry since accessing these records hadn't been officially authorized. Samuel nodded, but kept flipping through the thick stacks. They found an internal report noting that Mark had received 7 complaints within 2 years, all of which were marked unsubstantiated. Nearly every file ended the same way, quietly buried in the cabinet, gathering dust over time. As the pile of files stacked higher on the table, Ethan felt as if time inside that dim room had frozen. He knew these pages were key not only to clearing Grace's name, but to exposing an entire network of protection and cover-ups. Each case was a thread, and when woven together they formed a wide net encircling Mark and his allies. Samuel glanced at him, his expression heavy but tinged with a flicker of hope, as if both men understood they had just unlocked the door to the deepest part of the truth. The metal door groaned shut behind them, plunging the room back into shadows and dust. But for Ethan, the image of those decade-old files remained sharp in his mind, every word printed like a silent vow that one day they would be read aloud before the public. And when that day came, the forgotten names would no longer be faint lines in an old report, but voices demanding that an entire system be held accountable. Suddenly, a torn page caught loose from its binding. The young attorney stepped forward quickly, flipping through the rest of the folder, discovering that the entire conclusion section and key witness testimonies were missing, replaced by vague notes that wrapped the case up abruptly and suspiciously. In the table of contents at the front, the missing materials were still listed, including 1 audio recording and 2 written statements from primary witnesses. The emptiness left the room silent, save for the dull hum of an old fan rattling in the corner. Ethan bent over fingertips, brushing the jagged edge of the torn paper, feeling each rough groove like an unhealed wound. He read what remained, seeing Mark Rayner's name repeatedly linked to actions like scene coordination and witness interviews. Stranger still was a faint handwritten note, scribbled in the margin, likely jotted down in a hurry, containing only 3 words, "case handled already." The phrasing didn't resemble standard legal terminology. It read more like an internal code, a quiet signal to shut a case down. Samuel narrowed his eyes, his gaze sharpening as he compared this case with others they had just reviewed. He realized this wasn't isolated. In at least 4 other files, the conclusions were either redacted or replaced with rewritten summaries that scrubbed anything incriminating about Mark and his team. The more they read, the clearer the pattern became. Key witnesses missing, unlogged evidence, and every case ending the same insufficient grounds to pursue investigation. Ethan leaned against the table, his eyes sweeping over the towering stack of files. In his mind, pieces of information began connecting into a larger picture. This wasn't just a string of individual violations, but an intricate network of cover-ups. It didn't stop at a few officers. It reached through the report. Writers, the record keepers, all the way to those with the power to close a case. Everything functioned like an automated system where the moment a sensitive case arose, the gears would turn, erasing anything that might incriminate someone within the circle. The young attorney looked at Ethan, his voice low but sharp. "We're not just investigating a case. We're going up against a machine." Samuel nodded slightly, then took out his phone to photograph the torn page and the handwritten note. He spoke quietly, almost so only the 2 others could hear. "If we want to drag this whole network into the light, we'll have to take on more than just Mark." Ethan didn't respond, but his eyes spoke for him. In them was a mix of anger and a new kind of resolve. A resolve not only to bring justice for Grace, but to dismantle the entire system that had sheltered and empowered people like Mark for years. The yellow light fell across the floating dust particles as if to remind them that these pages had lain untouched in the dark for far too long. But now they had been uncovered, and once the truth had begun to surface, Ethan knew he would never let it be locked away again. The abandoned warehouse sat isolated at the edge of the old industrial zone, its rusted tin roof reflecting the dull gray light of an overcast afternoon. Patches of wall, peeled away dry vines curled around a warped iron frame, and inside the scent of rust mixed with the must of rotting wood hit sharply. Ethan stepped through the entrance, and the sound of his shoes on the concrete floor echoed hollowly, each footfall repeating through the vast empty space. In a shadowed corner, a figure leaned against a steel pillar, lean but sturdy, a worn coat dusted with a thin layer of grime. It was Jack Harlan, the former officer mentioned in several old reports. Ethan had uncovered a man who left the force after filing internal complaints and disappearing from public view. Jack looked up as Ethan approached, his gray-blue eyes marked by deep lines like someone who'd seen too many things ordinary people couldn't bear. His gaze moved quickly from Ethan's head to toe, stopping at the faint scrape on his wrist where the cuffs had been, then lifting again with quiet scrutiny. He pulled a cigarette from his coat pocket, lit it, and the thin curl of smoke wrapped around his gaunt face. "I heard about what you did," he said, voice raspy and slow, like each word had been worn down by time and disappointment. "You think Mark's the only problem? That whole department's rotten top to bottom." Ethan held his gaze, not reacting too quickly. He knew Jack wasn't someone who trusted easily, and that comment wasn't a threat, but a test. Jack took a deep drag, flicked ash to the ground, then went on, "I used to believe blowing the whistle from inside would change something. I turned in enough evidence to strip 5 guys of their badges, but guess what? All of it vanished from the files. A week later, they transferred me. Then I got a little advice that I should resign if I didn't want trouble." He gave a dry laugh, brittle as the wind pushing through gaps in the broken roof. Ethan listened silently, every detail Jack revealed matching what he had found in the old archive. The cover-up network he and Samuel had suspected was now being confirmed by someone who'd lived it. Jack stepped closer, his voice lower but sharper. "Mark's just one cog. He's good at getting his hands dirty, but behind him are people even better at scrubbing everything clean. Paperwork, footage, statements, all taken care of before they ever see daylight." He paused, dropped the cigarette to the floor and crushed it beneath his heel like putting an end to a story he'd been forced to swallow for years. The warehouse fell quiet for a long moment, save for the creaking of metal as wind passed through the rafters. Ethan took a step forward, his voice low and steady. "So, you came here to tell me I can't win?" Jack shook his head, the edge of his mouth twitching, not quite a smile, but no longer closed off. "I came because you did what I couldn't, you made them afraid. That punch you landed on Mark wasn't just a hit, it was a signal that the wall can crack. But you need to understand, if you wanted to bring the whole wall down, you're gonna need more than 2 fists." Dim light from the warehouse door cast Jack's face half in shadow, half in the silvery glow of late afternoon. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a thin envelope, unmarked, tied with an old string of twine. "Inside are a few copies of files I managed to keep before I left the department. Not much, but enough to name a few guys you haven't heard of. Don't ask how I got them, just know that if you use them, strike fast, because they'll know the second you put this out." Ethan took the envelope, its weight coming not just from the papers inside, but from the unspoken truth that this was a step deeper into the fight. He gave a slight nod, tucking the envelope into his coat, then asked, "And you just going to stand on the sidelines?" Jack didn't answer right away. He turned and walked toward the warehouse door, his thin frame blending into the gray light. As he stepped outside, he paused and called back, "I used to think I could live quietly after walking away, but you reminded me there are debts you can't walk out on. Call me when you need to." The warehouse door closed, leaving Ethan alone in the dimness, his hand resting on the envelope as if feeling the warmth of an unexpected ally. He knew from this moment on what he was up against wasn't just a brutal cop, but an entire system that had rotted through, and he now had someone who'd once been inside it to help lead the way. Jack walked slowly to a worn wooden table set against the wall where a small metal box, coated in dust, had been pushed into a corner, as if no one wanted to touch it. He bent down, unlatched the rusty lock, and the metallic click echoed through the emptiness. From inside, Jack pulled out a bundle of files wrapped in dark oilcloth, the edges frayed the smell of old paper, and rust rising thick in the air. He laid it on the table, untied the cord, and slid it toward Ethan, his eyes watching the other man's reaction closely. Ethan opened the file, the pages neatly clipped but marked with faint fingerprints and a red pen. On the first page was a copy of an investigative report that had vanished from the official archive, along with scene photos and a printed transcript of a recording. The red internal confidential stamp was still visible proof that it had never been cleared to leave police hands. Ethan turned the pages, his eyes scanning each detailed account of how a case was deliberately altered. Mark's name came up repeatedly, but what made Ethan pause was the list of people who approved the adjustments. It wasn't just direct supervisor. There were signatures from a deputy chief and 2 members of the city council. The signatures were officially stamped with dates matching the time key evidence had disappeared. This was no longer a matter of one man abusing power, but a coordinated power structure built to protect its own. Jack pointed to a specific page, one that contained notes from an internal meeting between senior officers and representatives from the mayor's office. In the notes, a handwritten line had been crossed out but was still legible. "Keep this in-house, don't let the press get hold of it." That short sentence was living proof that every level knew the truth and chose to hide it together. Ethan felt his throat dry, realizing this was the key to proving Grace wasn't the only victim and that her death was the result of a system rotten from the roots. The old ex-cop leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You see it. If you take down Mark, they'll just find another to replace him. But if you use this, you'll force the ones at the top to show their faces. What they fear most is being dragged down with him, and this is what can drag them." Ethan didn't respond, but his hand tightened around the file, feeling its weight not just in paper, but in the years it had been buried. He pictured the moment these documents would be brought before the public, and the chain of protection would have nowhere left to hide. Jack stood upright, arms crossed, as he looked at Ethan, no longer with scrutiny scrutiny, but with a cautious trust. I've held on to this all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to. Now I think you're that person. But remember, once you put it out there, there's no going back. Ethan nodded slowly, not because he didn't already know, but because he'd prepared for this a long time. He knew this move would thrust him into an even bigger storm, but also that it was the only chance to expose everything that had been buried. Outside, the faint light of the late afternoon filtered through the doorframe, casting a thin streak of gold across the cover of the file. Ethan closed it, tucked it into his coat, feeling like he was holding a fuse that once lit would shake the entire power structure on the other side. And he understood from this moment on his fight was no longer just about vengeance for Grace, but about dragging an entire system into the light so no one else would ever have to share her fate again. The courtroom was brightly lit, every seat in the gallery filled with television cameras aimed directly at the bench. Murmurs rippled through the space, but as soon as the judge entered, the noise dropped instantly, leaving only the echo of the gavel striking 3 times. Ethan sat on the witness bench, hands clasped in his lap, eyes fixed on the long table in front of the prosecution where a stack of thick documents had been neatly arranged ready to be presented at any moment. Mark sat on the opposite side, his gray suit pressed and crisp, but his face was stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line, lacking his usual confidence. The prosecutor stood, his voice clear and commanding through the microphone, reading the indictment with deliberate precision. From Mark's abuse of power and excessive use of force to tampering with records and witness intimidation, each charge was listed in order, tied to specific dates and incidents. With every detail mentioned, the courtroom murmured again, and a few spectators shook their heads or whispered to those beside them. Ethan glanced over and saw that Mark showed no expression, but beneath the table, his hand clenched into a fist, knuckles pale. When the prosecutor finished reading the charges, he signaled the technician to prepare the video. The courtroom fell completely silent, the air so heavy it felt like it could be sliced. The large screen at the front flickered on the image, grainy at first, then sharpening a dark alley, flickering streetlights. Grace's silhouette stumbling in the narrow passage. Then Mark and 2 other officers approached, his voice audible, each word laced with mockery and threat. Everyone held their breath as Mark struck the first slap, knocking Grace to the ground, followed by a second, a third, until she stopped moving. The dry thuds echoed in the room, each one like a hammer blow against the silence. In the gallery, some covered their mouths, others looked away. A woman near the aisle wiped away tears while Samuel, seated at the back, clenched his jaw, his hand trembling on his knee. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen, forcing each frame deeper into his memory, refusing to look away despite the weight rising like a lump in his throat. When the video ended, the lights in the room came back on, but no one spoke. The judge sat upright, tapped his gavel lightly to remind the room to remain orderly, though it took him a few seconds to find his voice again. The prosecutor looked around and spoke slowly. "This is the full recording, uncut, unaltered. The court and the public have witnessed it together today. There is no longer any excuse to deny it." His words rang out clearly, paired with the footage just shown, further tightening the already compressed atmosphere. A few reporters scribbled quickly, cameras panned across faces from Ethan, who remained stoic, to Mark, who sat still, but with a slight twitch at the corner of his eye, a sign of unraveling control. In that moment, Ethan understood this was the turning point. The file from Jack had opened the way, but it was this publicly screened video that delivered a direct blow to Mark's facade. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, knowing the trial was only just beginning, and what followed would determine whether justice would truly be served. Mark suddenly shot to his feet, the chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor, jolting the entire courtroom. His face flushed, red veins bulging at his temple, and his voice cracked through the thick Elon trap. "This is all a trap. They set me up." The sound echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a stone tossed into a still lake, setting off a wave of whispers across the gallery. The judge struck the gavel repeatedly, ordering the defendant to maintain order, but Mark refused to sit his eyes, scanning every corner of the room as if searching for someone to blame. His attorney, a salt-and-pepper-haired man in a dark suit, immediately stood, raising a hand to request permission to speak. His voice was calm but firm, trying to redirect attention away from his client's outburst. "Your Honor," he said, "we have newly obtained evidence that must be presented immediately, as it may alter the fundamental nature of this case." The atmosphere in the room shifted into a new kind of tension. A few reporters lifting their heads from their notepads, cameras swiveling quickly to catch every move. From his briefcase, the attorney pulled a set of photographs and several pages of reports, handing them to the court clerk to be delivered to the judge and prosecution. He began to explain, according to him, the evidence indicated that Grace had been covertly investigated in connection with the drug trafficking case, and that the video shown captured only a portion of the incident, omitting the context of Mark intervening in an unlawful act. The images were blurry, the reports lacked official seals, but he read them aloud with unwavering conviction, as if stating unquestionable facts. In the audience, some people shook their heads, others exchanged uneasy glances, while Mark sat down, still breathing heavily, but now with a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. The prosecutor responded instantly, rising to his feet and requesting the court review the legitimacy of the evidence before it could be entered into the record. He emphasized that the documents appeared to be unverified copies, and the content matched known false claims previously removed from social media. The judge frowned, signaling both sides to approach the bench for a direct exchange as murmurs swelled across the courtroom, tension peaking. Ethan, seated at the witness stand, watched every movement closely, his heart pounding, knowing that if this evidence were accepted, it could become the weapon that twisted the entire trial. The exchange between the judge, the prosecutor, and Mark's attorney lasted several minutes, their low but sharp voices blending with the rustling of papers. Finally, the judge turned back to the room and announced a recess to assess the authenticity of the evidence before deciding whether it would be admitted. The decision immediately thickened the atmosphere as if a cold draft had swept through. Mark leaned slightly back in his chair, glancing at his lawyer, then at Ethan, with a provocative look as if to remind him that this battle was far from over. Ethan held his gaze, offering no verbal response, but silently reminded himself that this was merely a stalling tactic, a familiar move to divert attention. He knew that if Mark's team had produced this evidence so quickly, they likely had more plays prepared to delay and dilute the weight of the truth. Samuel, seated a few rows back, gave a small nod toward Ethan, a silent cue that they still had aces left to play. And Ethan understood that the next part of the trial would require careful calculation at every step, because the other side had just made it clear they were willing to use whatever it took to survive. In the afternoon, weak sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, stretching into pale beams across the wooden courtroom floor. The air was thick with silence and anticipation, every gaze fixed on the judge's bench where the gavel rested beside a case file. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice low but clear through the microphone, announcing that the jury had reached a final decision after days of intense deliberation. Ethan sat in the witness stand, hands clasped, feeling each heartbeat echo with the rustle of the clerk turning pages. Mark, seated at the defense table, tried to appear composed, but his shoulders tensed slightly, eyes darting across faces as if searching for something to hold on to. Defendant Mark Rayner, the judge, began each word, landing heavy on the desk for the proven charges of abuse of power, aggravated assault, tampering with investigation records, and witness intimidation. The court court sentences you to 25 years in prison. The gavel struck 3 times, shattering the silence and triggering a wave of murmurs through the gallery. A few people let out quiet cheers. Others exhaled in relief while at the back, Samuel closed his eyes, hands clenching and then slowly releasing, as if shedding part of a long-held burden. Mark tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching. It was unclear whether it was a sneer or just a reflex upon hearing the sentence. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered something, but Mark didn't respond. His gaze locked onto Ethan, cold and sharp, as if silently promising that this wasn't over. Ethan met that stare calmly, though. Behind his eyes burned a fire that had never gone out, the fire that had carried him from the dark alley where Grace was killed to this very moment. The judge continued reading the extended decision of the sentence. Furthermore, based on evidence presented during the trial, the court orders a federal investigation into additional officers connected to this case. The list includes individuals who signed off on altered reports and those who interfered with witness testimonies. That statement drove deeper into the wall of power that had long shielded Mark and his associates. Reporters immediately scribbled notes, camera shutters clicked in rapid succession, and lenses swept across every face in the room. A few officers, seated in the gallery, lowered their heads to avoid being caught on camera, while others sat rigid eyes forward as if realizing they too had been brought into the spotlight. Ethan heard hushed, anxious whispers from the rows behind him mixed with the hurried footsteps of someone leaving the courtroom the moment the judge finished speaking. The late afternoon sunlight cast a pale yellow glow across Mark's face, highlighting the creases at the corners of his eyes and the stiffness of his jawline. The escorting officers approached, and the soft clink of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed faintly but sharply like a final punctuation mark on the years he'd been protected by his uniform. As he was led past the witness stand, the distance between them narrowed to just a few steps. Ethan remained seated, tilting his head slightly to follow, saying nothing because he knew the court had spoken on his behalf. Samuel stepped forward, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and gave a light squeeze in acknowledgement that this long, grueling journey had yielded results. But both men understood this was only part of the battle. The fact that other officers were now under investigation meant the protection network still existed and could retaliate at any moment. Ethan's eyes followed the courtroom door as it closed. Mark disappearing behind the 2 officers, then shifted to the prosecution table where the stack of files remained a quiet reminder that more truths still waited to surface. Out in the hallway, the crowd had gathered reporters, jostling for questions, cameras aimed directly at Ethan's face as he stepped out. He didn't speak immediately, only paused for a breath before saying clearly, "This isn't the end, it's just the beginning." And as he walked away, the sound of the gavel from the courtroom echoed in his mind, a reminder that justice had been set in motion, but the road to see it through was still long. Ethan stepped out of the courthouse afternoon light, brushing his face in a pale gold hue, but his eyes remained sharp, his expression tense. A small group of supporters cheered from the sidewalk, their voices mixed with the snapping of camera shutters and the rush of questions from reporters. He didn't stop to shake hands or accept congratulations, just kept walking through the crowd with steady steps. When a reporter broke through holding out a microphone and asking if he was satisfied with the verdict, Ethan paused briefly, looked straight into the lens and said in a calm, firm voice, "There are still names left unspoken. When they're all brought forward, then we can call it justice." The words caused a hush, followed by a surge of new questions, but Ethan had already turned away, heading toward the waiting car. Those words quickly became headlines on the evening news. The footage showed Ethan standing among the crowd, microphones aimed at him, a bold caption below, "There are still names left unspoken." The press described it not as a victory celebration, but a statement of continued resolve, and most major outlets called today's verdict the first crack in a wall of power that had stood for years. In opinion columns, many writers noted that sentencing Mark to 25 years wasn't just a legal event. It was a signal that a system long tilted in favor of the powerful was finally beginning to feel pressure to change. On social media, the phrase, "the first Crack quickly became a trending hashtag accompanied by images of Mark in handcuffs and Ethan's quote. Some viewed it as a symbolic moment, the beginning of sweeping reform, while others remained cautious, believing it was still too early to trust in any meaningful change. Beneath the posts, thousands of comments shared personal stories, many recounting experiences of police abuse and expressing hope that Grace's case would become a catalyst for bringing similar incidents to light. Ethan sat in the car, looking out the window at the crowd that had yet to disperse, signs held high with messages demanding justice still swaying in the wind. He didn't feel completely relieved, because what filled his mind wasn't the image of Mark being led away, but the list of names Jack and the confidential files had revealed people still seated comfortably in positions of power, waiting for a chance to restore their protective shield. He knew the next chapter wouldn't involve the noise of a courtroom, but quieter confrontations where every move could be blocked by subtle, calculated tactics. That night, as the phrase, "the first crack," spread across news channels, Samuel called Ethan, his voice low and measured. "We've opened a breach. Now we have to push before it gets patched up." Ethan didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the window, where streetlights lined up into streaks of light. Inside, the sentence echoed like an unspoken command, forcing him to keep moving forward, even knowing that ahead lay a thick wall with many layers of protection. As night fell and the city quieted, Ethan, in his temporary workspace, spread out all the documents he had marking the names never mentioned in the press. The desk lamp cast a glow over the pages, his shadow stretching long across the floor, and in that moment he understood clearly that the first crack would only matter if he turned it into a deeper fracture, one that would bring the entire wall crashing down. The high school auditorium filled with the sounds of scraping chairs and hurried footsteps as students poured in. On the small stage, a warm yellow light fell across the wooden podium where Ethan stood holding a microphone, but not bringing it to his mouth. His eyes scanned the young faces before him, some still in uniform jackets, others resting their chins on their hands, waiting. Behind him, a banner reading Seminar on Justice and Civic Responsibility hung neatly reflecting the soft light from the overhead fixtures. As the noise died down, Ethan took a deep breath and began. His voice wasn't dramatic or shaky, but calm and clear, as if every word had already been arranged in his mind. He spoke of Grace not as a victim, but as a vibrant person, a dedicated nurse who always took the late shift so the last patient on the list could still be cared for, a wife who planted flowers on Sunday afternoons and left him little notes whenever he left for work early. He recounted that final night, not in painful detail, but enough for the whole room to feel the weight of the injustice. The rows of seats fell silent in attention, a few students leaning forward, eyes wide. A boy in the third row raised his hand, curiosity and hesitation flickering in his eyes. When the mic reached him, he asked, "What if you had stayed silent?" The question came out softly, but cut straight to the heart of the story. Ethan paused, his gaze dropping to the wooden floor before lifting again, locking eyes with the boy. "If I had stayed silent," he answered, voice low and steady, "everything that happened to Grace would have become a single line in an internal report, then locked in a drawer no one would ever open. The people who did it would still be in uniform, still on patrol, still laughing like nothing had gone wrong. And eventually, someone else would become the next Grace." He stopped, letting the words settle into the heavy air of the room. Ethan set the microphone down on the table, then stepped closer to the front of the stage, closing the distance to the first row. "Silence is what abusers of power want us to choose," he continued, voice firmer, "because silence makes us invisible. It makes the story disappear. But when one person speaks up, they create space for others to speak too. And when enough voices rise together, no one can pretend they didn't hear anymore." At the back of the room, a teacher nodded gently, a stack of papers in her arms, while a few students recorded on their phones. Light from the windows streamed in at an angle, making dust float like tiny sparks through the still air. Ellen took a deep breath, letting his eyes scan the young faces once more, quietly, wondering if any of them would carry the spark that had just been lit today. When the bell rang to signal the end of the session, students began leaving their seats, but a few stayed behind to talk. A small girl stepped forward holding a notebook in her hand, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know everything about Miss Grace, but I'll find out. I want to write about this for the school paper." Ethan gave a slight smile, nodded, and felt that Grace's story had just moved beyond the boundaries of a courtroom or a verdict, becoming a piece of memory passed on to the next generation. He left the auditorium once the schoolyard had emptied, the sound of dry leaves rustling under his feet. In his mind, the boy's question still echoed a reminder that the journey was far from over, and that speaking up would remain necessary until no one ever had to ask again. "What if you had stayed silent?" Ethan looked straight at the boy who had asked the question, his eyes unblinking, his voice lowered but so clear that every word echoed through the auditorium. Then someone else would have died. No further explanation was needed. The sentence cut through the thick air like a blade, silencing the scattered whispers instantly. Students in the back rows stopped twirling pens, stopped shifting in their seats, all eyes now fixed on the stage where Ethan stood in stillness for a few seconds, as if letting the weight of his words settle. A boy in the front row bowed his head slightly, hips pressed together, while the girl next to him clutched her notebook tightly. In the back, a teacher leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her eyes dimmed as if recalling something buried. The silence in the room wasn't from a lack of sound, but because everyone was held in the grip of the same thought that a human life could be taken simply because those nearby chose not to intervene, not to speak. Ethan's gaze swept across the auditorium, and even the faces that had looked indifferent at first were now attentive. He knew his answer had reached them. He stepped slowly toward the edge of the stage, his hands clasped in front of him, voice lower but steady in pace. "When we stay silent, the bad guys take it as permission. They'll keep doing what they want more aggressively, more brutally, until no one dares to stop them. Every moment of silence gives them another step forward, and then there will be another Grace, another victim whose name we'll only learn when it's too late." His words weren't grandiose, but they carried a weight the audience could feel, like a stone pressed gently into the palm of a hand. Below, the air remained heavy. Even the students, known for whispering and giggling during assemblies, were dead silent, eyes locked on the podium. A few discreetly recorded on their phones, not to post right away, but as if to preserve the moment just as it was. Sunlight angled in through the windows, lighting up floating specks of dust, and in that glow, Ethan's face came into sharp focus, etched with the lines of exhaustion and resolve. He stepped back, exhaled slowly, then spoke more softly, as if meant only for each person in the room. "Justice doesn't find its way on its own. It has to be called out. It has to be defended. If not, it disappears, as if it never existed." Those final words came with no dramatic gesture, yet they held the entire auditorium in place for a beat longer just before the bell rang to end the session. No one stood up right away. The silence lingered a few more seconds, a natural pause for everyone to gather their thoughts. Then the sound of chairs sliding began, scattered and slow. A group of students walked toward Ethan, saying nothing, only nodding in quiet thanks. He nodded back, his expression calm, but deep down, he knew the moment just passed would stay with those present far longer than the talk itself. As he stepped into the hallway, the sounds of the schoolyard returned, voices, laughter, the thump of a ball, the whir of bike wheels over tile. But the weight of the silent room clung to him, still a reminder that what he said today wasn't just a story about the past, but a warning for anyone choosing silence in the face of injustice. The city council chamber glowed under bright ceiling lights, the rows packed with officials, reporters, and citizens in attendance. The atmosphere was tense, but full of anticipation. Everyone knew today's session would mark a major turning point after the historic trial. The council chair, dressed in a dark suit, tapped the gavel lightly to open the meeting. His voice rang clear as he announced the main item. As of today, the city will enact a law requiring all police disciplinary records to be made public. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, some scribbled notes quickly, and camera flashes sparked in rapid succession. A few reporters rushed to send updates to their newsrooms, knowing this clause would bring an end to years of internal secrecy, forcing every misconduct to stand before the public eye. Ethan sat near the back, eyes fixed on every word being read. He understood the value of this law better than anyone, because it was hidden records that had allowed people like Mark to exist and operate unchecked. When the chair explained that all disciplinary files, even closed cases, would be stored publicly on an online platform, many in the room nodded in agreement. A woman stood to speak, her voice shaky but firm. We've lost too much because of silence. This is the first time I feel hope that my child will grow up in a safer city. Her words drew a round of applause echoing off the high ceiling and lasting several seconds before fading. Soon after, another council member rose to present a second proposal: mandatory surveillance cameras at all high-conflict areas and locations with repeated police complaints. He emphasized that cameras would not only be placed on busy streets but also in neighborhoods where tensions between police and residents were common. Each recording would be archived and monitored by an independent oversight committee not directly under police control to ensure objectivity. This announcement stirred fresh discussion across the room. Some raised concerns about privacy, but the majority agreed it was a necessary step to protect both civilians and officers who conduct themselves with integrity. Ethan leaned forward, jotting down a few notes in his notebook. He knew that if properly enforced, these new laws could become powerful tools against the cycle of violence and cover-ups. A reporter nearby turned and asked for his thoughts, but he replied only briefly. This is a start. What matters is who enforces it. His answer reflected the concern many in the room shared. Laws can change on paper, but reality only shifts when someone ensures they can't be bent. The meeting continued with questions and counter-arguments. A young council member, formerly a human rights attorney, presented a detailed plan for managing data from surveillance cameras and the procedure by which citizens could access disciplinary records without facing legal barriers. She stated clearly, "If we let the police department control the information, this law will be an empty shell. Oversight must be in the hands of the public." Her words were met with applause from the audience, while a few conservative council members remained silent, unable to argue against the overwhelming support. As the meeting neared its end, the council chair announced that both laws would be passed and implemented in the upcoming quarter. The entire room stood, many shook hands, and a few shed tears. Ethan remained seated for a few seconds, taking in the scene, sensing that the change lay not only in the words just approved, but in the eyes of those who now believed they had reclaimed a portion of the power once taken from them. He stood up and stepped outside where the late afternoon sun slanted across tall buildings, and a clear thought echoed in his mind. This wasn't the end, but the foundation of a city willing to face the truth instead of burying it like before. After the passage of the two new laws, the city council chair moved on to announce the next step: the formation of a community oversight board with independent authority to monitor the enforcement of the new regulations and investigate any complaints related to police misconduct. He explained that this board would include representatives from various sectors: attorneys, investigative journalists, social activists, faith leaders, and respected members of the general public to ensure the community's voice would be heard at every level. Each member would be selected through a transparent public nomination process free from direct influence by any law enforcement body. News of the Oversight Board immediately sparked a strong reaction in the chamber. Many stood to applaud, some turned to one another for brief exchanges, their expressions a mix of hope and caution. A veteran journalist stood to speak. "This will only truly matter if the board has full access to data and documents unblocked by claims of false security concerns. That reminder prompted nods throughout the room, a clear warning that new authority must be shielded from the shortcuts long normalized by the old system. When the list of potential members was read aloud, many were surprised to hear Ethan's name. The council chair explained that with his first-hand experience exposing wrongdoing and persistent pursuit of justice, Ethan would serve as an independent advisor to the board. His role would not involve administrative oversight, but rather objective evaluation of each case submitted, providing recommendations based on evidence and helping connect the board with civil groups, human rights organizations, and individuals who could offer crucial information. Ethan accepted the role amid the attentive silence of the chamber. He stepped up to the microphone, and spoke in a voice that was steady, not proud. "I accept this position because I understand the fear of those who've faced the choice between staying silent and speaking up. This board must not become an empty symbol. It has to be a place anyone at any time can come to and be heard." A few rounds of applause followed, not loud, but lasting enough to show that his words had reached many in the room. After the meeting, media outlets quickly reported Ethan's appointment, calling it a logical and highly symbolic move. Many articles recounted his journey from a husband who lost his wife under unjust circumstances to the central figure driving reform. But for Ethan, what mattered more were the specific tasks ahead. He spent the evening reviewing the board's draft operating regulations, making notes on each clause that might be used to delay or evade responsibility. In the days that followed, Ethan joined meetings with other board candidates. He listened to the story of a mother who lost her son during a police intervention, of a former officer who resigned rather than cover up wrongdoing, and of a young attorney who had repeatedly defended clients treated unjustly. Each account deepened his belief that the oversight board, if run properly, could become a shield for the most vulnerable members of society. Ethan knew he hadn't taken the role for praise or to have his name printed on documents, but to ensure the reforms just won wouldn't erode over time. He remembered Grace's eyes in the wedding photo that once hung in their small apartment, and reminded himself that this work was part of the vow he had sworn to keep, a vow that no one else would have to suffer loss like his because a system chose to protect the guilty. And from that moment forward, he made it clear this independent advisor position would not be a title but a new front line. The state prison stood isolated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towering gray concrete walls, their tops lined with coils of razor wire glinting under the harsh afternoon sun. Ethan passed through the security gate, the metallic door clanging shut behind him with a dry echo, leaving a heavy sense of separation from the outside world. A long hallway, smelling of disinfectant mixed with dampness, led him to the visitation room, where rows of metal chairs and glass panels separated two worlds, one of freedom, the other of confinement. When directed to table 3, Ethan sat down, hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on the opposite door. Moments later, Mark appeared in an orange prison jumpsuit, walking slowly, his gaze lowered to the tiled floor as if avoiding the confrontation. The guard motioned for him to sit, placing a light hand on his shoulder to keep him in place. The clear glass reflected both their images, but only Ethan looked straight ahead, his stare sharp and cold, while Mark turned slightly away, trying to place distance not just through the barrier, but through his eyes as well. Ethan watched every movement of the man who had once stood before him with smug arrogance, convinced that the law was merely a curtain he could manipulate. Now, Mark's hair was longer, slightly unkempt, his face lined with fatigue, though a trace of defiance remained in his upright posture. He reached for the receiver attached to the wall, but said nothing, eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan before dropping again. Ethan picked up the phone, his voice low but clear. "Do you remember that night? The question wasn't meant to be answered, only to strike directly at Mark's crumbling defenses." Mark gave a faint, bitter smile that faded as quickly as it came, replaced by a sidelong sidelong glance. The silence dragged on the room heavy with the quiet hum of a ventilation fan. Ethan didn't look away, knowing that with men like Mark, avoiding eye contact wasn't just instinct. It was fear, no matter how deeply it was buried. Across the glass, Mark turned the phone slightly in his hand as if searching for an excuse to cut the visit short. Ethan remained calm, didn't push, letting the silence stretch a few more seconds before continuing. "I didn't come here to hear you apologize. I came to let you know you don't have any power left out there. Every one of your allies, every one of your enablers, they'll end up sitting right here too." At those words, Mark clenched his jaw. His shoulders tensed and his hand gripped the phone cord so tightly his knuckles turned white. In that moment, Mark's eyes lifted slightly, but didn't dare meet Ethan. He only glanced briefly, then turned away again like a man who knows he's at the end of the road, but still refuses to let his opponent see the collapse. Ethan watched the reaction with absolute clarity, neither gloating nor pitying, but with the certainty that this confrontation had shifted from a personal battle to a broader message, a message that those who abuse power will ultimately be brought into the light, no matter where they try to hide. As the guard signaled that time was almost up, Ethan set the receiver down, stood and kept his gaze fixed through the glass. Mark shifted slightly, eyes lowered to the table, saying nothing. Ethan turned and walked out of the visitation room, the metal door closing behind him with a loud clang like a period ending the encounter. In the hallway leading back to the gate, he took a deep breath, sensing the fresh air of freedom drawing closer, and reaffirmed within himself that this wouldn't be the last time he faced someone like Mark, but every time it happened, he would never be the one to look away first. Ethan remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the metal table, leaning slightly toward the glass divider. His voice dropped low and steady, each word compressed by years of waiting. "You'll remember Grace's name until the day you die." It wasn't a shout, not a threat, but a cold sentence that cut deeper than any verdict handed down by a court. Across the glass, Mark froze for a moment, the fingers that had been turning the phone cord pausing mid-motion. He trembled slightly, a reaction too quick to conceal, then quickly tried to regain composure, the corners of his mouth lifting into a faint sneer. But the sneer couldn't hide the crack in his eyes where a flicker of unease surfaced before being shoved hastily back inside. Ethan held his gaze, letting the silence stretch as if forcing Mark to live through each second of that sentence. In the sterile white light of the visitation room, everything felt frozen. The slow spin of the ventilation fan, the scratch of the guard's pen outside, and the locked stares of the two men across the thick pane. Mark tilted his head, pretending to look elsewhere, but the movement that felt more like retreat than defiance. A sneer can create a facade, but it can't erase the fact that his body reacted before his mind could intervene. Ethan saw it, and he didn't need to say another word to confirm he'd struck the right nerve. Across from him, Mark still sat upright, but his left hand under the table was clenched into a fist, the knuckles pale. The thin smile on his lips had become a desperate attempt to preserve pride, as if he still had any say in how this story would unfold. Ethan leaned back slightly, setting the receiver down with a slow, deliberate motion, never breaking eye contact until the very last second. As the guard approached to signal the end of the visit, Mark remained seated for a brief moment, his eyes flickering before he finally turned away, hiding whatever expression had begun to surface. The door on his side opened, and he walked out without looking back, but that initial tremble stayed sharp in Ethan's memory, a sign that no matter how much he tried to deny it, Grace's name had seared itself into Mark's mind, permanent and unerasable. On the way out of the prison, Ethan felt with clarity that this meeting hadn't been about conversation nor about seeking remorse. It was a final reminder, an invisible blade he had driven deep into Mark's memory, so that every night in that cold, dark cell, Grace's name would be the last thing echoing in his head before he drifted into uneasy sleep. And Ethan knew that sneer was nothing more than a thin layer of dust over a wound Mark would carry with him until his final day. The narrow street, tucked between two low-rise buildings, usually overlooked suddenly drew the steps of every passer-by. On a freshly painted white brick wall, a large mural stood vivid under the morning sun. Grace's face was depicted with soft yet strong lines, her eyes wide open, looking straight ahead with a gaze both gentle and resolute. Below, bold, dark red letters stood out against the wall, "Don't turn away." The simplicity of the words contrasted with the weight of their message like an arrow pointed straight at the conscience of anyone who stopped to read. People began to gather in front of the wall, at first a few curious neighbors, then others passing by. Some stood silently, others raised their phones to take photos adjusting angles so the morning light fell across the face in the painting, making Grace's eyes seem alive. Quiet conversations filled the air mixed with the soft clicks of cameras. A little boy, holding his mother's hand, stood at the corner and asked Mom, "Who is that?" She replied softly but firmly, "Someone we must not forget." Soon images of the mural spread across social media. Photos taken from different angles, tagged with #Don'tTurnAway, started appearing constantly in feeds. Under each post were hundreds of comments, some expressing emotion, others sharing personal stories of injustice they had witnessed, and many pledging to tell their children and grandchildren about Grace. The wall, once a silent part of the street, became a place people sought out, not just to admire art, but to find a reason to remind themselves not to look away. Ethan stood at a slight distance, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't join the crowd, taking pictures or chatting, but quietly observed each face that paused in front of the mural. Every reaction, a focused gaze, a small nod, a hand resting on a companion's shoulder was proof that the message had landed where it needed to. He knew the mural couldn't change everything, but it marked a turning point, a fixed reminder in a city that never stopped moving. An older man with silver in his hair approached and placed a small bouquet at the base of the wall. No one asked him to. No instructions were given, yet others quickly followed. Within hours, the foot of the mural was filled with flowers, handwritten notes, and small photographs. The scent of blossoms, mixed with fresh paint and the warmth of sunlight, created a space both solemn and intimate. As evening fell and the streetlights turned on, the mural remained Grace's face, standing out against the white brick, and the words, "Don't turn away," seeming to glow in the dark. The crowd thinned, but a few still stopped to quietly read, take a photo, and move on. Ethan left the street when night had fully settled, but he knew that tomorrow, and for many days to come, that wall would continue, doing its work, reminding everyone that truth doesn't disappear when people stop speaking, only when they choose to look away. Samuel approached slowly, his shoes lightly tapping the stone pavement each step, seeming to weigh the past against the present. In his hands was a simple bouquet of white chrysanthemums wrapped plainly with a pale blue ribbon fluttering gently in the breeze. Standing before the mural, he bent down and carefully placed the bouquet at the base of the wall next to others that had been laid there since morning. The streetlight shone on his silver hair, highlighting the slope of his shoulders that trembled slightly. Samuel said nothing, just stood in silence, eyes fixed on the painted gaze, the eyes of the daughter he had lost, still looking out into the world as if never defeated. Ethan stood a few steps away, quietly observing. What he saw in Samuel wasn't weakness, but a quiet endurance that had lasted through all this time. Amid the few lingering passers-by, the older man's silence stood out like an absence that anyone walking by could feel. Samuel gently touched one of the flower petals, then rested his hand on his thigh, eyes never leaving the mural. His lips pressed tightly together as if holding something in his chest. A light breeze passed, rustling the leaves of the nearby tree, carrying the scent of flowers mixed with fresh paint. Ethan stepped closer, but didn't break the silence. He understood that sometimes quiet presence carried more weight than any words of comfort. After a few minutes, Samuel exhaled slowly, his eyes leaving the painting to meet Ethan's. They didn't say much, just a nod enough to pass between them a mutual understanding and wordless empathy. Ethan smiled faintly, not brightly but warmly, the way he often did to encourage those who had walked walked this path of loss with him. Then he turned and walked slowly toward the end of the street, leaving Samuel standing there alone beneath the amber glow and the wall still shining in the night. His footsteps faded into the quiet sounds of the city settling down, and in that moment he felt with certainty that both of them in their own ways were keeping Grace's story alive, not letting it fade with time. In the early morning, the park was still heavy with mist, the wooden benches dotted with tiny droplets reflecting the first rays of sunlight. Along the gravel path, birdsong blended with the rustling of tree branches and the breeze, creating a quiet so deep you could hear the dry leaves falling to the ground. Ethan sat on a bench near the lake hands, resting on his knees, eyes gazing into the distance as if watching something beyond sight. After all the meetings, articles, confrontations, and silences weighted with meaning, this was the first morning he wasn't driven by a schedule or the glare of camera lights. Soft footsteps approached, pulling Ethan back to the present. A boy, around 10 years old, stopped in front of him, his round dark eyes lit with curiosity. In his hands was a worn basketball, the leather peeling in spots. He looked at Ethan for a moment, then tilted his head and asked, voice innocent yet thoughtful, "Who are you?" A simple question, no hidden intent yet. It tugged at the long story behind Ethan. He glanced down at the boy, the corner of his mouth lifting into a slight smile. For a moment, he recalled all the faces he'd seen, the questions asked in that school auditorium, the eyes waiting for answers. His voice lowered, not loud, but firm, each word clear enough for the boy to hear. Someone who didn't turn away. No further explanation followed because he knew that answer was enough to spark meaning for the boy or for anyone who might hear it. The boy blinked, pressed his lips together in thought, then gave a small nod. He asked nothing more, turning to run back toward his friends on the grass, their laughter ringing bright through the open air. Ethan watched him go, then leaned back against the bench, eyes turned up to the canopy catching the sun. A beam of light slipped through the leaves and landed on his face, making his smile more distinct. In the distance, the city was waking, the sound of traffic rising like a reminder that life carried on. Ethan stood, walking slowly along the path that led out of the park. He didn't know where he'd go next, but one thing was certain: wherever injustice stood, he would still be the one who didn't turn away. And somewhere down the line, maybe one day, that boy from this morning would remember the answer and choose to face the truth rather than turn aside. The boy gave a small nod as if grasping a part of Ethan's answer, then ran back toward the waiting group of friends. His footsteps blended into the rhythm of playful noise, the basketball bouncing steadily on dew-damp grass. Moments later, his laughter rang out, clear and light in the crisp morning air, leaving behind a quiet space where the bench still held the warmth of the one who had just sat there. Ethan watched a moment longer, his gaze softening as if seeing in that boy a new seed of hope, the very thing he had tried to protect all along. He rose, hands tucked into his coat pockets, walking slowly down the tree-lined path leading to the park's exit. Morning sunlight streamed through the leaves, casting scattered patches of light across his shoulders and back, each step taking him farther from the field where the children played. Birds sang high above, blending with the whisper of the breeze like a farewell song, while the scent of fresh grass and damp earth clung to every breath. As he moved deeper into the trees, his figure slowly faded into the green, just a trace of fabric glimpsed between patches of light and shadow. The path curved, and his silhouette slipped gradually out of view, but his presence lingered, blending into the landscape as naturally as a quiet promise to remain wherever he was needed. For a moment, the now empty space returned to its usual rhythm, but for those who had seen him that morning, the image remained a small yet lasting imprint in their minds. Outside the park gates, the city grew busier, the sounds of engines and voices merging into a familiar backdrop. Ethan merged into the crowd, leaving no obvious trace beyond the sense that someone everyone had just passed through with the story not yet finished. The sight of him disappearing into the morning trees became a simple yet vivid moment, a reminder that sometimes those who leave quietly leave the deepest mark. The story closed as Ethan's footsteps vanished among the trees, but his journey did not end there. From a husband who lost his wife to a hidden tragedy, he had transformed grief into strength, doggedly bringing the truth to light. Every step he took came with its trials, from Mark's direct threats and blatant lies from within the force to the crushing pressure of a divided public. But instead of retreating, he chose to confront it all again and again, until not only Mark but the entire network of protection was exposed. Along the way, Ethan had traveled from the dark corners of a market alley where injustice began to the brightly lit courtroom where justice was declared. He had seen witnesses risk everything to speak out, as well as those who vanished in fear. He had witnessed the power of a united community under a shared message and the weakness of a system when faced with undeniable evidence. Above all, he understood that justice never arrives on its own. It must be fought for by those willing to pay the price. Mark paid with years behind bars, but for Ethan the victory was not in the sentence but in a city forced to change. New laws were passed, police disciplinary records made, public surveillance cameras installed where there were once blind spots, and a civilian oversight council was formed with Ethan as an independent advisor. It was not just the result of persistence but a milestone, proving that one voice, when echoed by many, can spark change on a far greater scale. The mural bearing Grace's face and the words "Don't turn away" became a symbol of the city, a permanent reminder that turning away from injustice is the same as allowing it to continue. Everyone who passed that wall took something with them, a thought, a question, or a new resolve. And the image of Ethan, the man who didn't turn away, was etched into the memory of those who had met him, including a young boy who happened to ask a question in the park one early morning. The lesson left behind by Ethan's story wasn't just about courage or persistence. It was a clear affirmation that change always begins by facing the truth, no matter how hard it is to accept. Silence may help someone avoid immediate trouble, but it opens the door for tragedies to repeat. Only when someone is willing to break that silence does justice have a chance to exist. And when one person does it, they inspire others to rise as well. Ethan wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, just an ordinary man pushed into a situation where he had to choose between enduring and resisting. He chose the harder road, the longer one, and the one with more loss, but it was the only path that allowed him to keep the promise he made to Grace that her name would never be forgotten and the truth about her death would never be buried. This story, then, does not end with him walking away in silence, but continues to live on in every action, every word, and every decision of those he inspired. And the most important lesson is that anyone, even standing alone, can be the one who doesn't turn away when facing injustice. That single moment, however small, can be the starting point of a change so great that an entire community will feel its impact.